Hello my fiery friends, the Infernoman here with the hottest in budget deck technology. And for today's deck tech, we're going to be continuing the series of super ultra budget deck techs out there. How budget are we talking? Well, how does it sound to not need a single rare or mythic to put these together?
It's a bold strategy, Cotton. Let's see if it pays off.
So without further ado, let's go ahead and jump right into it as we play a deck that I'm calling, basically, Artifacts. But before we continue, if you do like any of the content that I do, please like, follow, and subscribe wherever you watch the content so you don't miss out on any of the gameplay, booster pack openings, deck decks, and so much more. Longtime viewers of the channel know how we do it. We have to talk about the stats of the deck before we jump right into it. So this is a completely colorless deck of an average mana curve of about 2.1. You're looking at about 24 creatures for the deck, 40 artifacts, that does of course include the creatures, and of course 20 lands. So as I suggested at the beginning of the video, we're going to be all in on artifacts. This is a no-nonsense, all-aggro build. But you may be wondering in your head, why play an artifact build that's completely risky and very susceptible to a ton of removal in the format, despite the fact that you basically could play any other aggro deck?
Good question!
Well, I'm glad you asked that question because we're about to show you why this is so unique and also surprisingly pretty versatile versus very other decks in the format. So let's actually talk about first all of our creatures and we'll talk about our plan B to the deck. So in terms of the aggro plan, we're looking at cards such as Gingerbrute here, which is a hasty 1/1 that also has a little bit of extra utility where it can either be unblockable unless if an opponent has a creature with haste, or you can sack it to get some extra life back. We have also in the 1-drop slot Iron Apprentice. It just has a +1/+1 counter, but that could be great so if you have to chump block with it to pump up something else with that counter. Walking Bulwark here doesn't seem like it does much because it only has Defender and it's a 0/3, but that secondary ability where actually you can pay 2 to then turn on another target creature, giving it haste and then attacking as though it didn't have Defender, and you can also assign combat damage equal to its toughness rather than its power is pretty sweet. Now going into the 2-drop slot, we only have one creature here specifically. It's going to be Patchwork Automation. This thing will get huge very quickly because every time we cast an artifact spell, you get to put a +1/+1 counter on the automation. Not to mention, it also has Ward 2, so it has built-in protection, which mostly means that if your opponent wants to get rid of it, they're going to have to spend a lot of mana to do so. In the 3-drop slot, we have our Lord here, Chief of the Foundry, which gives all of our artifact creatures +1/+1, and you also will have Foundry Inspector here. This will make all of our artifacts cheaper by 1. This means that in theory, you can also cast then your Walking Bulwark, Iron Apprentice, or Gingerbrute for free.
You had my curiosity, but now you have my attention.
Now, finally, you're probably thinking, that's basically it, Infernoman? What makes this so special?
This is where the fun begins.
So what if, of course, all of our artifacts get blown up or get spot removed before we can do anything? Well, we also have that plan B that I just mentioned earlier, which is going to be a stuffed bear. We have Mimic, and we have Oval Chase Dragster, along with High Speed Hoverbike. 2 of them are just simple artifacts, but Stuffed Bear and Mimic specifically can be turned on for 2 mana each apiece, and you can either have a 4/4 Green Bear Artifact Creature token, or the Mimic can become a 3/3 Shapeshifter Artifact Creature token. Either way, you can turn these on, but it allows you to, of course, do some more damage, while your opponent might have to then spend a little extra mana just to get rid of them. However, even if those get blown up, we also have a little bit more versatility with High Speed Hoverbike. This flash flying vehicle also can then enter the battlefield and then tap down a creature that an opponent controls, giving us a really sweet tempo play, and also you can crew it for 1, so it's super cheap to crew, and because it's flying, it has evasion built into it. Really awesome for us in the mid to late game. And then finally, our finisher is going to be Oval Chase Dragster. Probably nobody actually remembers this card was a thing, but I do, of course, and I really appreciate what it does for our deck. It has trample, it has haste, and it's a vehicle, but when you crew it for 1, it becomes a 6/1, which basically means it's kind of like a, what is that card? What's that old school card that used to be? Ball Lightning? Oh yeah, does anybody here actually remember Ball Lightning except me? Oh geez. Yep, I'm old enough to remember Ball Lightning. Moving on, of course, Oval Chase Dragster here, once you tap it, of course, can do some massive damage to close out the game against our opponent. As far as the mana base is concerned, since we are a colorless deck, we do have a little bit of a unique advantage here, allowing us to use utility lands that normally are not available to us, but because we have this ability, we're going to take full advantage of it this time around. So, of course, our basics are still going to be wastes. However, because of the colorlessness, you can use Zalfrim Void here. When it enters the battlefield, you can then scry 1, allowing you to filter out your next card draw. You have Radiant Fountain here, which allows us to stabilize. By entering the battlefield, it gives us 2 life. And then because sometimes, assuming your opponent blows up every single thing, but maybe your Oval Chase Dragster or your High Speed Hoverbike is still in play, you can also use Mech Hanger here. So this simple little card allows us, of course, to tap down either for colorless. We don't really care about the secondary ability because we don't really need to cast anything else except for just colorless cards. But otherwise, The final ability for 3 and then tapping it means a target vehicle becomes an artifact creature until end of turn. This of course will help us ensure that we can still get through with our vehicles and finish off our opponent to get to our victory. Now, as far as how the game plan works for the deck, all it basically means again is you're just going to try to play everything on curve just like any one of our other basic decks we've done out there. However, your game plan of course will change depending on how your opponent is going to be playing cards. So if they are not going to be a very aggro deck and you anticipate there's going to be wraths, you mostly want to just hold on to your cards and just try to do as much damage as you can with 1 or 2 creatures until they get to a point where they're going to have no choice but to start burning up wraths and removal on each of your individual cards. With that, if they are playing a lot more of a go wide or aggro plan, you're going to have to probably throw out your whole board out there in order to ensure you have enough creatures and cards to then stop them from doing their game plan. Don't be afraid to trade a little bit here and there or then just do some bad blocking. I know that seems a little weird to say, but it's only because, again, with the way our deck works is we want to try to keep the field clear until we know we can start swinging with cards such as your Oval Chase Dragster, or we can turn on our Stuffed Bear or Mimic, and then remember that these cards, even if you have a Chief of the Foundry out, will get the pump ability, so they will do even more damage than you may expect. With that, of course, some of the other biggest advantages you will have is, with cards such as your Walking Bulwark or your Gingerbrute, you can still stabilize yourself pretty well with these cards, because with Walking Bulwark, remember, that ability also can turn on other cards that have entered the battlefield this turn, and you may want to turn them on to do some extra hasty damage. Sometimes having to sacrifice that Gingerbrute could mean the difference between either surviving or losing a match, so keep that in mind, of course. And finally, that I'm going to mention, it's very rare that it'll come into play, but if you have to then sacrifice your Mimic to add in some mana just to cast something else, by all means do so. Again, the deck is actually a lot more versatile than most other players may think out there. It may look a little wonky because, again, we don't really have anything that initially will do heavy damage until you start playing out your creatures on curve, but I can assure you it will get the job done. Since we are all in on artifacts, yes, that means we are super susceptible to artifact hate as well as creature hate, so be aware that if you do want to play the deck, it's going to be expected that you all have to deal with that, but because we are all in on artifacts, that honestly enough can give us a bit of a small advantage, because unless your opponent has a bunch of specific wraths for artifacts and artifact creatures, you're mostly going to still be able to then push through some damage here and there. Of course, when you have to deal with certain decks such as control decks out there or mid-range decks, you will struggle, of course, with this. But remember, this is a budget deck. This is a beginner style of deck if you're interested in introducing someone to the artifact strategies that are out there. Now, having said that, if you are interested in upgrading the deck, again, since this is a budget one, we're not going to go all in on explaining anything here. Instead, I'm going to, of course, show you on screen right now. There are several deck types if you're fascinated with the artifact game plan, and there's so many different ways you can then go into artifacts in many different varieties. You can either go in on the artifact creature strategy. You can go with a combo style of deck. You can do a control deck. If you want to go more colorless and focus a little bit less on artifacts, there are some great colorless cards out there that can do a lot with what you invest if you want to do some more upgrades. Because of how unique this deck is, this was definitely one of the toughest ones I had to kind of put together, and it actually took a while before I finally found something that I was mostly satisfied with. So for those of you out there who want to take this for a spin, I hope you do get a chance to enjoy it. But otherwise, my final thoughts I just want to give on the deck is, if you are a fan of artifact decks out there, if you're a fan of aggro plans, if you're a fan of playing a deck that's actually more versatile than most other people may see at surface value, by all means, definitely give this deck a try. And when you do play this deck, I assure you, it's actually pretty fun to pull off some wins with it. You'd be surprised at what it can pull off, because a lot of opponents don't expect this style of deck in the format, and you will definitely not be disappointed. That's all I have for you today. Thanks again for watching, everyone. And just remember that no matter what you do play in the game of life, always be sure to burn bright. Later.